Welcome back everybody, and today we're going to be comparing different color options over different colored base coats and primers to see what sort of different effects we can get. And what we're trying to chase here is a teal type finish or color on our Space Marines, and we've got a few different options that we're going to be starting with. The first one that we can see here is using a standard Zenithal black primer and applying with a brush the marine blue FW ink directly over the paint, and it produces a relatively dark sort of finish. And then we're going to go in, and in this instance here we're just using a sponge method to apply a mixture of Stegodon scale green and Araman blue, and we will progressively work our way up to a lighter tone to finish with a highlight with the Araman blue over the top of the model. And just this is a process I've used in the past. It works quite well with the dark base coat, so that you don't do any Zenithal prime. You end up with the nice dark recesses if you apply the paint progressively and carefully, so that you don't flood any of the low areas, and you want to keep those dark. It saves you having to go in and do pin line washing after the fact, so it certainly speeds the process up. And it only takes a few applications. If you thin the paint down, it might take maybe 4 or 5 coats to get to a final result, but the end result does work quite well. And we can see here just putting on a very small amount of an undiluted Araman blue just as the finishing highlights on this little chap here. And number 2 in the list, as we move progressively down the models that we're playing with, we've used a FW ink again over the black Zenithal base coat, but in this instance we've now used a white Zenithal, and instead of painting the FW ink on, we're actually trying to apply it with an airbrush. And if you look closer, you can actually see that there seems to be some separation happening, even though the ink wasn't particularly diluted in any way to go through the brush because it is quite thin. Unfortunately, it created somewhat of a marbled finish on the model, and that necessitated going in and trying to blend out and obscure that mottling. And the way I did that was to mix the FW Marine Blue with Citadel Sotec Green to create a bit of a wash, and then apply that over the model in a couple of thin layers just to disguise the texture, so to speak, and give a more uniform finish. But we don't need it to be completely perfect. We just want to get rid of some of that obvious dark white patchiness that is apparent on the model. And it did take a couple of applications because it was slightly thinned down. Obviously it's better to go progressively rather than to do it all at once, and I didn't want to lose some of the darkness, so it was just a matter of taking it nice and slowly. And then once that layer had dried and built up sufficiently, it was going in then with the Araman blue, which is just a touch lighter, to produce some highlights around the model, and so a little bit around the edges and on the areas of the model that are going to get the most light, and just applying that again with a brush, so being selective with how we do it, a little bit of edge highlighting here and there, and then finally going in with Ionic blue, which is quite a bright blue, again being very light with the application, just trying to place that on the areas where you have the maximum highlight, where you can see the light reflecting there from the light source, and that gives us that sort of brightness that we're looking for without going too crazy. And again, just in this instance, just using a mottled finish by using the sponging method. Number 3 was again Zenithal black primer with a Zenithal white overspray, and then this time going in with Citadel's Pterodon turquoise. Now this is a contrast paint, and I've noticed through using some of them that they tend not to really separate and pull away and create a substantial amount of contrast effect. And this was particularly noted once this was painted. It was very uniform in finish. There certainly wasn't any real pulling away from the edges greatly. Everything did have a similar sort of tone, but it produced a nice sort of texture to work on, to go over the top with. And in this instance, sticking with the green tones, we went with Citadel's Sotek Green to create a highlight over the top. And because there was a reasonable amount of darkness in the base coat, grading through to a sort of mid-tone, it just required that we sort of picked out those highlight areas with the Sotek Green, and again to have a nice textured finish that isn't consistent, just using the sponge method. Another option we went with was doing a black Stynylrez Res Prime and using Vallejo's Gamer Ink Blue as a Zenithal. So instead of using a white Zenithal, we just sprayed at a 45-degree angle the blue ink, and leaving those areas that are sort of in shadow as primarily quite a dark finish, in some instances quite black. But this was an idea that I used on a couple of models, and to differentiate them I chose one and then came in again this time with the Pterodon Turquoise contrast paint, applying it with a brush, this time over the Vallejo Game Ink Blue. And you can clearly see it darkens everything down a fair bit. You don't really get the contrast effect, but it does give you a darker base coat that does have a coloration in it. So if you've got that plain black, it does add just a little bit of hue, so it's not so monochromatic. And for this option here, I pulled out the Vallejo Game Color Turquoise, which is a little bit darker than the two Citadel paints that I had, the Araman Blue and the Sotek Green, and used the sponge method to apply that across the model in a sort of a liberal type fashion, but progressively building it up over time, and just trying to create that graduation from the dark shadows into the mid-tones, and then running up to the highlights. And this time around, over the sort of the darker turquoise, we went with the Araman Blue because it is a little bit lighter, and used that as a finishing touch. This is lucky last model that we had. Again, it was the Vallejo Game Ink Blue applied as a Zenithal over the Stynylrez Black Prime, and because it was quite black, used an Araman Blue wash. So the Citadel paint just watered down. You can see on the right it has darkened the blue color down, but not as much as the Pterodon Turquoise. So we did that, and just as the last model, chose to use the Vallejo Game Color Turquoise, again going into sponge over the top of that paint finish, just to start to lighten everything up and bring it closer to a sort of a teal color, or at least somewhat of a teal color. And obviously the purpose of this was to see what would be the most appealing of those colors given the starting point and the paints that were being used over the top. And it takes several coats to build it up, and you can still see that some of that blue is still showing through in part. Not so much worried around the chest plate where the Aquila is, because that will be painted separately, but definitely going in and trying to provide some coloration. And I like to sort of do things progressively rather than do it all in one hit, so it does take quite a few rounds, but it's only about a minute per coat sort of thing, dabbing lightly to provide a sort of a base, and then just progressively building that up, going back where you want to create some more color, and then with the Araman Blue over the turquoise to bring out the brightness, so going for some of the highlights to provide a sort of a nice variation across the model. We will go in later and do edge highlighting, that sort of thing, but this is just getting that mid-tone to highlight value sort of completed on the model. And the good thing is with the sponge you get that irregularity, so you get a nice sort of texture. It provides a sort of a non-uniform finish that you end up having something that has a nice sort of dirty, gritty sort of feel to it. And this is a summary of all of them. starting with the first one there that we did with the FW ink, with the Armin blue and the Ionic blue over the Zenithal highlight. And then number 2 was Pterodon turquoise over the Zenithal, and just used then the Sotek green, and it is a bit greener, you can see. The next 2 here, we used the Game Ink blue as a base, but we had the different sort of base coats. One was the Pterodon turquoise, and the other was the Araman blue. And lucky last is our darker looking marine, where we use the Stegodon scale green and then the Araman blue sponge effect over the top. And pulling out, we can see all 5 of them lined up there, and there is a bit of variation. And in summary, we can kind of see we've got a choice of colors, and certainly my preference, I think, is starting with the black base coat or a very dark base coat, because it saves you having to go in and do pinline washing, which is required on some of the lighter ones, given the base coat wasn't as dark, and you don't tend to get as much grittiness or the appearance of that sort of grim dark finish. That would be something you'd have to go in with either a wash afterwards to try and create. But the primary sort of focus on this was to try and find a reasonable color combination that produces a teal-like finish if you're looking at creating an army with that color option. And that's where we got to. So thanks very much for watching. Hopefully this was somewhat educational and entertaining enough, and see you in the next one.